Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the flickering torchlight of a Frankish palace, where shadows loom larger than the people who cast them. You smell beeswax melting, you hear the shuffle of armored boots, and somewhere a young servant girl carries water without daring to spill a drop. That girl, if you lean in close, is Fredegund, someone whose name you probably haven't whispered before, but you're about to. She's not born into silk or jewels. She's a household slave stuck polishing goblets that kings will drink from. And here's your little reality check. You probably wouldn't survive a week in 6th century Neustria, not unless you enjoyed lice combs, drafty wooden halls, and bread so dense you could use it as a building material. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing that, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is on your clock right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge with Fredegund through the chill corridors of Soissons, where her early years are half invisible. No chronicles list her parents. Some say she was a freed woman's daughter, others that she was simply plucked from obscurity by chance. Historians still argue whether she was attached first to Queen Aldovera's household or whether she began directly as one of King Chilperic's attendants. Either way, she's the invisible thread in the royal tapestry, pulling from the back, almost unseen. And here's a mainstream fact to anchor you. The Merovingian dynasty, with its flowing-haired kings, ruled much of what's now France during the 6th century. Chilperic Roferge, Fredegund's future husband, was one of the squabbling sons of King Clotaire I, and he inherited Neustria, the northwestern kingdom centered on Paris and Soissons. Imagine yourself carrying jugs of watered wine down long timbered halls. The nobles barely glance at you, unless to mutter about whether your shoes are tied. But Fredegund, even in her low position, is watching carefully. She learns which courtiers stumble home drunk, which clerics sneak sweetmeats, which guards are half asleep at midnight posts. Quirky tidbit. In some Frankish households, servants were expected to wake nobles in the morning by pulling gently on their hair, because apparently alarm clocks hadn't been invented, and rooster crows were far too democratic. Fredegund notices something else. The king has wandering eyes. Chilperic is already married to Queen Aldovera, but his household simmers with flirtations. Here, history gets messy. Some sources claim Fredegund began as Aldovera's maid, brushing out her mistress's hair while secretly plotting to snatch her husband's attention. Others suggest Chilperic simply noticed Fredegund fetching water and thought, well, that's convenient. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's rise was calculated seduction or opportunistic fate. You picture her quiet, clever, deliberately invisible until she doesn't want to be. One night, while passing Chilperic's chamber, maybe her candle flickers just enough to cast her features in flattering light. He notices. She lingers, and soon the invisible servant girl starts to carry herself like someone rehearsing for a larger stage. The palace is not Versailles. Don't imagine glittering chandeliers. Think smoky braziers, unwashed wool cloaks, and dogs lying right on the hall floor, chewing leftover bones. The background hum is less soft fan noise and more grunt of a pig wandering in from the courtyard. And yet, to Fredegund, it's a universe of opportunity. Every spilled goblet, every whispered word could tilt her life toward the throne. You, standing beside her, see ambition flash in her eyes, just as a nobleman grumbles about taxes. The Franks were notorious for heavy, uneven levies. Sometimes cattle, sometimes bushels of grain, sometimes a few unlucky villagers pressed into labor for a royal project. Fredegund absorbs these complaints, storing them for later, the way a squirrel hides nuts. The scandal that will make her infamous is still far off, for now she's a shadow among shadows, sharpening her wits like a knife. She watches Queen Aldovera glide by in embroidered linen, heavy with jewels, and you can almost hear Fredegund's unspoken thought, that could be me. And in this palace where everyone jostles for power, being underestimated is her greatest weapon. You lean in as she smooths her apron, bows politely, and tucks her smile away. A servant girl, yes, but one who has already begun to play a game that most nobles don't even realize has started. You stay close as the smoky palace corridors stretch out, their torchlight trembling against rough-hewn walls. The smell is equal parts roast meat, damp straw, and someone's boots left too close to the hearth. Tonight, the great hall is full of voices, laughter echoing under timber beams, and you notice how King Chilperic's gaze keeps wandering away from his queen, Audovera. His eyes flick to where Fredegund pours wine, her movements calm, almost sleepy, as though she hasn't noticed the weight of a royal stare. But you know she has. Fredegund's rise is not explosive, it's quiet, almost like moss creeping up a wall. Step by step, whisper by whisper, she becomes the woman who answers when the king calls late at night. You can imagine the court whispering, hiding grins behind goblets. Mainstream fact, in Frankish society, polygamy wasn't exactly approved, but kings often kept multiple consorts. Merovingian law technically allowed repudiating a wife, but it left behind awkward ripples, especially when daughters and sons were already involved. So picture this. Queen Audovera still seated at the dais, and down below, Fredegund now receiving gifts meant only for noble ladies. Gold bracelets, a cloak trimmed with fur, the kinds of things no servant should dare to wear. It's like your boss suddenly handing the intern the corner office keys. You'd whisper too. And here's your quirky tidbit. Frankish queens had a particular ritual after childbirth. When a queen gave birth, she was temporarily excluded from church services until purified. One story says Fredegund tricked Audovera into attending a baptism at the wrong time, causing scandal in the church and giving Chilperic the excuse he needed to put Audovera aside. Historians still argue whether this tale was fact or just slander penned by moralizing bishops who didn't like ambitious women. You imagine Fredegund brushing her hair at night, knowing the queen's seat grows colder every day. In the hallways, you overhear noble women muttering, half envy, half fear, because once a servant girl proves she can topple a queen who's safe. Chilperic, for his part, isn't exactly subtle. He dines with Fredegund, laughs with her, even lets her interrupt when courtiers drone on about land disputes. He begins to parade her at hunts, draping his arm over her shoulders while Audovera tries not to look. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of tagging someone a little too often in royal scrolls. You're there when Audovera finally vanishes from her seat. Some say she was sent to a convent, others that she faded into quiet exile. But Fredegund? She's suddenly sitting taller, wearing brighter silk, daring to look Chilperic in the eyes across the banquet table. The rise feels almost like a dream you drift into without noticing. One moment she's carrying pitchers, the next she's receiving homage as consort. The nobles grumble, but they bow anyway. That's how power works in Neustria. Today's gossip becomes tomorrow's normal. You pause near the fire pit, listening to a court jester's half-joke, better polish your shoes, or Fredegund will polish off the queen herself. The laughter dies quickly. No one wants to be overheard, but you sense something else. Fear, because Fredegund's ambition is no longer hidden. It's seated right at the king's side. You wake with the caw of ravens circling over Soissons, the morning air sharp with frost. Inside the palace, the corridors are hushed in a way that tells you something has gone wrong. Servants move briskly, but whisper under their breath, eyes darting, and you know before anyone says a word, Queen Galswintha is gone. Here's the mainstream fact. Chilperic, restless as ever, had married Galswintha, a Visigothic princess, to strengthen his political position. She brought with her a rich dowry, lands, gold, and the prestige of her father's kingdom in Spain, but the match was never warm. Chilperic still kept Fredegund close, and Galswintha reportedly begged him to either let her go home or to stop humiliating her. He agreed to neither, and then, suddenly, terribly, she was dead. You stand with the courtiers as they shuffle their feet, pretending to believe the official line. Maybe she died suddenly in her bed, they murmur, or perhaps it was a tragic accident, but the truth flickers in their eyes. Everyone suspects foul play. Quirky tidbit, Frankish chroniclers loved euphemisms. When someone suddenly died in bed, it was about as subtle as saying someone in a soap opera went upstairs and never came back down. And now, history takes a dramatic twist. The death of Galswintha isn't just a private scandal, it becomes a political earthquake. Her sister Brunhild had married Chilperic's brother, King Sigibert of Austrasia. So imagine it, two royal sisters, one murdered, one grieving, and both kingdoms suddenly at odds. Historians still argue whether Fredegund herself arranged Galswintha's murder or whether Chilperic acted on his own and simply placed Fredegund on the throne afterward. Either way, the timing is suspicious. Within weeks, Fredegund is queen. You trail her steps as she walks into the great hall wearing the title that once belonged to a Visigothic princess. The nobles bow, their faces carved from stone, but you hear the muttered question in their throats. Did she kill to sit there? Life in the palace does not pause. The feasting continues, torches crackle, hounds gnaw bones at the edge of the hall. But you feel the tension woven into every tapestry. It's as though the walls themselves remember Galswintha's silks brushing past. You wonder what happened to her belongings. Were they given to Fredegund, or did servants quietly hide them away, too afraid to let the new queen see them? Fredegund, for her part, is not apologizing. She smiles thinly, she plays the role of consort, she soothes the king with gentle words. And you, watching from the side, realize she has achieved what few ever dreamed. From servant girl to Queen of Neustria, the scandal only makes her presence heavier. At night, the palace feels different. You hear a door creak, a hushed laugh, and then silence. And maybe it's only your imagination, but the air seems to whisper, "Beware the bed where queens die suddenly." The torches flicker lower as the feast winds down, and you lean against a pillar, watching Fredegund lean closer to Chilperic. Her voice is low, almost soothing, like a lullaby turned slightly sharp at the edges. The king nods, laughs at her whispers, then repeats her words aloud as though they were his own thoughts. You notice the pattern quickly. Fredegund plants the idea, and Chilperic waters it with his royal authority. Mainstream fact. The Merovingian kings were often criticized by church chroniclers for weakness, indulgence, and susceptibility to bad counsel. Gregory of Tours, that ever-judgmental bishop with his sharp quill, made a habit of blaming queens for leading kings astray, and Fredegund, already a scandal in his eyes, became the perfect villainess for his narrative. But you, standing in the smoky hall, sense a more nuanced game. She's not some scheming cartoon, she's simply better at reading the room than anyone else here. Take tonight's quarrel, for instance. A noble complains about taxes on his vineyards, muttering that soldiers steal more grapes than they protect. Chilperic looks bored, but Fredegund leans in with a suggestion. The king straightens, clears his throat, and suddenly he's declaring a new system for monitoring vineyards, exactly as she murmured seconds earlier. The noble bows, forced into gratitude, while you catch the ghost of Fredegund's smile, faint, satisfied, invisible to most. Quirky tidbit. Frankish tax collection was notoriously chaotic. Sometimes it was measured in livestock, sometimes in bread loaves, and occasionally in bizarre forms like wax candles or hunting dogs. Imagine trying to balance the royal budget when your accounts payable includes 3 hounds, 1 basket of onions, and a promise of hay. No wonder someone clever enough to streamline these affairs could wield quiet power. And then there's the bedroom, the realm where politics gets folded into linens. You picture Chilperic pompous in public but pliant in private, letting Fredegund's voice drip into his ear like honey. She strokes his pride, calls him wise, and you almost laugh as he beams, repeating her phrases in court the next morning. Historians still argue whether she was genuinely in love with him or whether it was all strategic survival. Either way, the effect is the same. Her words become decrees. The courtiers notice. Some sneer, some try to curry favor by addressing her before the king. Others spread sly rumors. A servant girl turned queen? It unsettles the social order. You overhear one knight mutter that next time perhaps his horse will end up on the throne too. The joke dies in his throat when he spots Fredegund's cold glance. The mood in the palace has shifted. Where once the air smelled only of wood smoke and mutton, now it's tinged with suspicion. Every decision seems to have Fredegund's fingerprints. She doesn't sit at the head of the table, but the invisible thread of her influence stretches across the hall. And you, leaning beside the hearth, realize something. The kingdom of Neustria isn't ruled by the loud voice of Chilperic, but by the quiet hum of pillow talk in the royal bedchamber. The palace settles into uneasy rhythms, and you follow the echoes of children's laughter down a drafty corridor. But those giggles aren't carefree. They belong to the king's older sons from earlier marriages, stepsons who suddenly find their futures less certain with Fredegund now at the queen's side. You sense it in the way their tutors bow more quickly, the way guards glance away, the way their very presence feels like an accident waiting to happen. Mainstream fact, Chilperic had several sons before Fredegund entered the picture. Theudebert, Merivec, Clovis, and others, boys who under normal circumstances would inherit lands, armies, and crowns. In Merovingian law, kingdoms were split among sons, often leading to bloody fraternal rivalries, but Fredegund's rise added an extra twist. Any child she bore would be competing against half-grown heirs who already had claims. You see the tension at feasts. A stepson raises his cup, speaks confidently about his future, and you notice Fredegund's eyes narrow just slightly. Later, when the boy's cup is refilled, she's smiling sweetly, too sweetly. Quirky tidbit, poison was the medieval gossip columnist's favorite explanation for every royal death. Wine, bread, even roasted quail could be fingered as tainted, and in Fredegund's case, rumor claims she practically had a poison cabinet beside her sewing basket. Yet historians still argue whether those sons truly died by her hand, or whether disease, common in the 6th century, claimed them instead. After all, epidemics swept through Frankish courts with frightening regularity, and the line between coincidence and conspiracy was often paper thin. Still, when stepsons began to fall ill, people whispered. Imagine yourself walking the cold stone floors at night, hearing muffled coughs behind shuttered doors. A servant rushes past with a basin, another with herbs, while Fredegund glides calmly through the hall, her gown whispering against the rushes. The sick boys see her shadow before they see the physician. Some cross themselves, some turn their faces to the wall. But the most chilling thing is how casually court life continues around the danger. The hunts, the feasts, the prayers all roll on, while gossip about the queen's family management buzzes like gnats in every corner. Even you, trailing the hallways, feel that unspoken warning. If you were her stepson, you wouldn't sleep too soundly. The palace feels like a hive after dark, buzzing with whispers that never quite die out. You move through the corridors and hear them. Maids scrubbing floors, guards polishing spears, clerics hunched over scrolls. Everyone has something to say about Queen Fredegund. None of it is said loudly. Instead, it's muttered into goblets, tucked into side conversations, always followed by a quick glance over the shoulder. Mainstream fact: Gregory of Tours, the bishop who chronicled much of this period, fills his pages with rumor as much as fact. His tales of Fredegund became legendary. He accused her of plotting against anyone who threatened her, even her husband's children. Some modern historians argue he exaggerated her cruelty because he disliked her challenge to church authority. Still, his gossip caught fire, spreading through courts and taverns alike. Imagine standing in a drafty hall as a chamberlain leans close to another and whispers, "They say the queen's handmaids carry powders in their sleeves." The listener stiffens, pretends not to care, then hurries away before the walls can repeat it. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Frankish folklore, walls were believed to remember treachery, so some servants literally avoided speaking near stone pillars, convinced the architecture itself would tattletale. The rumors about Fredegund vary wildly. Some insist she charms her stepsons, only to turn against them later. Others claim she rehearses curses under the moonlight. Historians still argue whether these whispers were grounded in real events or whether they were tools of political propaganda, fanned by rivals like Brunhild. Whatever the truth, the atmosphere is heavy with suggestion, like incense smoke that never clears. You trail a group of servants carrying bread from the ovens, and even they gossip. Did you hear? She smiled at the prince today. Then he should start writing his will. They chuckle nervously, but the laughter cracks halfway through. The strangest part is how Fredegund herself seems to glide through these whispers untouched. She smiles at courtiers, gives coins to priests, and cradles her own children tenderly. To see her in public, you'd think her reputation spotless. Yet at night, when candles gutter and shadows crowd the rafters, the palace swarms with tales of family management and a queen who sleeps with one hand always near a hidden dagger. And you, leaning at the edge of a torch's glow, realize something unsettling. It doesn't matter if the stories are true. In a world where rumor carries the weight of law, whispers alone can crown or damn a queen. The palace grows colder, though it isn't just the drafty stonework. You sense the chill in the conversations, the way noblemen glance at each other before raising their cups. And then, late one night, you overhear the most dangerous whisper of all, that Fredegund has gone beyond scheming, beyond poisoning, into something even more scandalous. People are murmuring about her and her stepsons, not as rivals, but as alleged bedfellows. Mainstream fact: medieval chroniclers relished scandal. To accuse a queen of incest, adultery, or sorcery was practically a pastime. Gregory of Tours hints that Fredegund may have seduced or manipulated her stepsons, not out of love, but as a way to control them or ensure their loyalty. Whether this happened or not is nearly impossible to prove, but the accusation itself, once seeded, stained her reputation for centuries. You picture it in the hushed corners of the hall. A clerk lowers his voice, mutters that Prince Merovingian was seen slipping from the queen's chamber. Another swears he caught her speaking tenderly to Clovis, though the tone was anything but maternal. quirky tidbit. In some Frankish courts, rumors were so absurd that they included tales of queens bewitching family members with enchanted hairpins, because apparently hair accessories were considered lethal magical tools. Historians still argue whether these liaisons were invented slanders or whether Fredegund truly blurred boundaries to tighten her grip on the royal family. After all, alliances in the 6th century often took strange forms: marriages arranged between children, half-siblings raised as spouses, and widows marrying their brothers-in-law. By those standards, the whisper of a queen sharing her bed with a stepson was both shocking and believable. You trail behind her down a candlelit passage. She glides as though rumors can't touch her, as though she thrives on them. And perhaps she does. After all, fear and fascination keep her name on every tongue. For a servant girl turned queen, maybe the greatest triumph is not respect, but the fact that no one can stop talking about you. You linger in the half-lit corridors, where the stones themselves seem to shiver with unease. Tonight the air is thick, and a child's scream breaks it, then silence. You follow the sound and find a servant muttering that Prince Dagobert has woken again, clutching his blankets, afraid of shadows that never leave. The rumor is that the boy dreams of poisoned cups, of candles that drip wax like blood, of a mother-in-law who watches too closely. Mainstream fact: Dagobert was one of the young princes of the Merovingian line, and like many royal children, he grew up in a world where his relatives were as dangerous as enemy armies. Gregory of Tours and later chroniclers suggest that Fredegund made use of poison, daggers, and even sorcery to protect her own children's inheritance. These reports may be exaggerated, but they reveal how unsafe a Frankish royal nursery could feel. And here's your quirky tidbit: 6th century Franks believed candles could ward off evil, but they also thought candlelight could betray you. If a flame sputtered or bent sharply, it was a sign that someone was casting a spell against you. Imagine being a child like Dagobert, watching the flame tremble and deciding it meant your death was creeping closer. The palace whispers that Fredegund keeps secret powders tucked away, powders that can be stirred into honey or pressed into ointments. Historians still argue whether she truly practiced poisoncraft or whether her rivals, especially Brunhild's supporters, simply slandered her with these stories. Either way, Dagobert's nightmares are vivid enough that the courtiers talk about them as if they're prophecies. You walk with the boy down the hall, his candle flickering, his eyes wide. He passes the queen's chamber and clutches your sleeve, as though even her closed door breathes menace. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters like bones. Inside, he whispers that he can hear her voice in his dreams. And you realize the cruelest truth of all. Whether Fredegund was guilty or not, the fear she inspired became a poison in its own right, one that worked slowly, candle by candle, night by night, until even children dreamed of daggers under their pillows. The bells of Soissons toll heavy in the air, and you sense the mood shifting. A king's footsteps no longer echo in these halls. Chilperic, loud and boastful only yesterday, lies still tonight. His death comes so suddenly that whispers dart through the corridors faster than servants carrying trays. Some say assassins struck him down while he hunted. Others insist divine judgment finally silenced his sins. The only certainty is that the palace, once noisy with his voice, now vibrates with something else: suspicion. Mainstream fact: King Chilperic of Neustria was indeed murdered in 584, struck down near his villa at Chelles. Chroniclers differ on who was responsible. Some suspected political rivals, others whispered about disgruntled nobles, and many could not resist hinting at Fredegund herself. After all, her reputation was already soaked in intrigue, and a widow who gained power so quickly was an easy target for blame. Picture yourself in the great hall that night. Courtiers huddle, brows furrowed, debating who will rule now. The king's body is barely cold, yet alliances begin to shift like sand underfoot. Fredegund, dressed in mourning black, sits silent, her face unreadable. She does not weep publicly, though her hand lingers on her son, her child with Chilperic, who now becomes the heir. The message is clear: she is the guardian of the crown. Here's your quirky tidbit: Frankish mourning customs sometimes involved wearing unwashed clothes for weeks, as if dirt itself proved sincerity of grief. But Fredegund, ever careful, appears composed, her garments dark but still regal, hinting less at despair and more at strategy. Historians still argue whether Fredegund arranged her husband's murder or whether she was merely the sharpest survivor in a bloody game. Either way, you can feel the unease as nobles bow to her, torn between fear and necessity. With Chilperic gone, she should have been pushed aside like so many widows before her. Instead, she clutches the regency like a torch in the night. You walk behind her as she passes through the silent corridors, the king's death still fresh in everyone's mind. And you realize, while others grieve, she calculates. The throne is no longer Chilperic's, it belongs to her child. And through him, to her. The air in the palace thickens with incense, not just from funeral rites, but from the steady haze of politics. You walk behind Fredegund now as she moves more slowly, every gesture deliberate, every glance heavy with meaning. A widow in 6th century Neustria was expected to shrink, to retreat into convent walls or fade into the background, but Fredegund refuses to disappear. She drapes herself in mourning black, yet sits upright, one hand on her infant son's cradle. Through that small bundle of royalty, she anchors herself to power. Mainstream fact, when Chilperic was killed in 584, his heir was an infant, Clotaire II. Fredegund became regent on his behalf. Female regencies weren't unheard of in Frankish history, but they were rare and always precarious. Powerful male nobles circled like wolves, hoping to grab the crown, but Fredegund proved remarkably adept at holding her ground. In the council hall, you hear a baron mutter that she should step aside for a male guardian, yet she silences him with a single look. You notice how her words, calm and measured, slice sharper than any sword. She invokes loyalty to the child king, paints herself as his natural protector, and reminds the assembly that her late husband trusted her. By the end, most men are nodding, even if their faces say otherwise. Here's a quirky tidbit. Frankish queens sometimes carried ceremonial keys, symbols of their control over palace treasuries. Imagine Fredegund, widow's veil fluttering, jingling a set of keys as if daring anyone to challenge her stewardship. You almost smile. It's like waving a medieval password that no one else knows. Historians still argue whether her regency was accepted out of genuine respect or sheer fear. Did the nobles bow because they saw competence or because they suspected she had already poisoned 2 rivals and didn't fancy being third on the list? Either way, her grip tightened. You follow her into the chapel where she kneels before the altar, lips moving in prayer. Her son babbles beside her, too young to understand the world being rearranged in his name. You lean closer and realize the truth humming beneath her whispered words. Fredegund is not only praying for protection, she is rehearsing power, cloaking her ambition in piety. The widow, who should have retired instead, wears her new role like armor, and as you drift in the incense haze, you sense that her story is far from winding down. It is only sharpening, like a blade hidden beneath a mourning veil. You trail behind Fredegund as she strides through Soissons, her mourning veil fluttering like a black banner. The palace still feels unsettled after Chilperic's death, yet her focus sharpens on one target. Brunhild, her sister-in-law, an eternal rival. You hear her speak the name as though it tastes bitter, each syllable heavy with decades of animosity. Mainstream fact, Brunhild of Austrasia was Galswintha's sister, the very woman whose marriage alliance had once bound Spain and the Franks. When Galswintha was murdered and Fredegund rose to the throne, Brunhild swore vengeance. Their feud became legendary, the War of the Two Queens, and lasted nearly 40 years, shaping Frankish politics more than most kings ever did. Fredegund, never one to wait, begins to plot against Brunhild's influence. You overhear her whisper to a captain about riders sent with false letters, stirring suspicion in Austrasian courts. You catch a glimpse of scribes forging documents, the ink glistening like midnight puddles. Quirky tidbit, in Merovingian diplomacy, forged letters were almost a cottage industry. One chronicler notes that wax seals could be heated, reshaped, and reapplied with surprising ease. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's plots against Brunhild were genuine political strategy or petty personal vendetta. Did she seek to secure her son's throne, or simply crave revenge for every sneer Brunhild cast her way? The lines blur, but the energy is unmistakable. You stand in the council chamber as Fredegund lifts her head and orders troops to prepare for border raids. Her eyes gleam with the predator's patience. Courtiers mutter about the risks. After all, Austrasia is larger, richer, and better supplied. But she silences them with one phrase: a child on a throne cannot afford an enemy queen. At night, in her private chamber, she traces routes on a wax tablet, tapping her stylus where Brunhild's allies live. You almost hear the scrape of quill against parchment as chroniclers sharpen their own stories, and you realize something chilling. While kings swing swords on the battlefield, queens like Fredegund wield quieter weapons, ink, whispers, marriages, and assassins in the dark. Her feud with Brunhild will become one of the strangest and fiercest rivalries of the early Middle Ages, and you, standing close enough to see her shadow flicker against the candlelit wall, sense that this battle of queens is just beginning to devour kingdoms whole. The drums of war roll softly at first, like distant thunder. You march alongside Fredegund's retinue as she oversees preparations for battle, not with sword in hand, but with words sharp enough to slice through armor. This is no petty quarrel anymore. Neustria and Austrasia, two halves of a fractured Frankish empire, are being dragged into a feud between two women. Mainstream fact, the War of the Two Queens pitted Fredegund of Neustria against Brunhild of Austrasia, stretching across decades and involving shifting alliances, assassinations, and open warfare. Male kings may have worn the crowns, but chroniclers knew the rivalry of these queens was at the heart of the conflict. You hear the clang of weapons in the courtyard, smiths hammering swords that catch firelight like angry stars. Soldiers mutter that their true commander is not the boy king Clotaire, still toddling in the nursery, but the veiled woman who surveys them from the balcony. Quirky tidbit: some Frankish armies marched to battle chanting psalms, while others carried charms or amulets against enemy spells. One unit in Neustria reportedly refused to fight until their horses' manes had been braided into protective knots. Imagine the battlefield prep looking like a medieval hair salon. Fredegund, always watching, sends spies into Austrasia. Letters are intercepted, alliances sabotaged, bribes delivered with sly smiles. Historians still argue whether she personally orchestrated every plot or whether ambitious generals carried out her will in her name. But either way, her fingerprints linger on the conflict like wax seals pressed into parchment. You walk the muddy roads with her envoys, slipping past villages where peasants stare in awe at passing knights. Taxes rise, bread grows scarcer, yet the war goes on because queens cannot forgive insults carved into their souls. The clash finally erupts on battlefields littered with splintered shields and broken spears. You stand at a hilltop as shouts rise and fall like waves. Fredegund is not there in person, but her will is. She prays in Soissons, lips moving, hands folded, while thousands bleed in her name. By nightfall, rumors trickle back, victories and defeats, prisoners and plunder. In the dim light of her chamber, Fredegund accepts the news with calm detachment. To her, it is not just war, it is an argument with Brunhild conducted in steel instead of words. And as you drift in that candle glow, you sense that this feud will shape not just the lives of queens, but the destiny of an entire dynasty. The air in the palace grows thicker with unease, as though even the stone walls have learned to expect bad news. You follow Fredegund into her private chamber, where a chest lies half open, filled not with jewels, but with little bottles, powders, and folded scraps of parchment. Courtiers whisper that the queen has a library of poisons and a habit of experimenting when her enemies least expect it. Mainstream fact: Gregory of Tours and later chroniclers reported multiple assassination attempts attributed to Fredegund. One involved daggers hidden in church services, another a poison that failed because the victim simply vomited it back up. Whether these stories are embellished or not, they reveal her reputation for creativity in eliminating rivals. Quirky tidbit: one tale claims she once coated a hunting knife with a subtle poison, hoping it would cut a rival just enough to infect him. Another suggests she ordered gold coins to be rubbed with toxins so that anyone touching them too often would sicken. These accounts sound more like medieval spy novels than history, but they stuck to her name all the same. You picture the scene: a noble raises his goblet at a banquet, smiling with relief when nothing tastes strange, but then he notices the queen's eyes on him, calm and unblinking, and suddenly the wine turns sour in his throat. Across the table, another lord coughs nervously, wondering if the roast quail was safe. In such an atmosphere, paranoia itself becomes a weapon. Historians still argue whether Fredegund truly possessed this arsenal of tricks or whether her enemies, particularly supporters of Brunhild, pinned every mysterious death on her shoulders. Disease was common, murder frequent, yet somehow every arrow and illness near Neustria seemed to bend back toward the queen's shadow. And you, drifting at the edge of the hall, realized that this reputation was power in itself. Even if she never mixed a drop of poison, the fear that she might was enough to bend men's wills. Few rulers in any age could boast such a weapon, the ability to kill with rumor alone. You step into the dim treasury chambers, where the air smells of iron locks, beeswax, and dust thick enough to muffle your footsteps. Here, Fredegund keeps more than gold. She keeps her power. The torches reveal shelves lined with jeweled goblets, bolts of silk folded like sleeping cats, and coin chests stacked so high they look like miniature fortresses. The nobles grumble about taxes, but you can see exactly where their silver ends up, hoarded under her watchful eye. Mainstream fact: Merovingian queens often had direct control of royal treasuries, symbolized by their possession of keys. Fredegund, as regent for her young son Clotaire II, wielded that privilege like a weapon. Whoever controlled the treasure controlled the loyalty of soldiers, priests, and mercenaries. She paid stipends, funded armies, and bribed potential enemies. Quirky tidbit: among the treasures said to be in her hoard were tiny reliquaries, containers for saints' bones, believed to bring both blessings and curses depending on whose side you were on. Imagine pawning off a finger bone of Saint Denis in exchange for a general's loyalty, medieval finance at its weirdest. Historians still argue whether her treasury was larger than her rivals, or whether chroniclers exaggerated to paint her as greedy. Brunhild's supporters claim she hoarded while peasants starved. Fredegund's defenders suggested she was simply prudent, saving for her son's future reign. Both views probably held a grain of truth. You trail her steps as she lifts a jeweled dagger from the chest, running her fingers along its hilt. To her, this is not decoration, it is insurance. She knows that nobles can be bought more easily than inspired, and coin has a longer memory than loyalty. The torchlight dances across piles of gold solidi, casting glimmers on the walls like captive stars. You can almost hear the whispers of every deal struck in secret, a soldier bribed, a rival appeased, a bishop silenced with a velvet purse. And as you stand in that cavern of wealth, you realize something. Fredegund's true throne is not carved from oak in the hall. It is built of coins and jewels, stacked high enough to outlast kings, queens, and perhaps even her own scandalous reputation. The bells of Soissons toll slowly, their sounds spilling across the cobblestone streets, and you follow Fredegund into the great cathedral. Today, the queen is not the whispering schemer of bedchambers or the iron-handed regent of council halls. She is a penitent figure, cloaked in dark robes, her head bowed as she walks down the long nave. Every step echoes, deliberate as if rehearsed. Mainstream fact: in early medieval Francia, rulers often staged acts of public repentance to shore up legitimacy. The church held immense moral authority, and appearing humble before God could erase political stains in the eyes of subjects. Fredegund, accused of murder and manipulation, certainly needed these performances. You kneel near the stone pillars as incense swirls, watching her press her forehead to the cold floor. The bishop intones prayers, and the congregation murmurs responses. To the casual eye, this is a widow seeking mercy for her soul. Yet you notice the sidelong glances, nobles watching her as carefully as she watches them. Quirky tidbit: some penitential rituals required rulers to walk barefoot through the city carrying relics. Imagine a queen trudging through mud while peasants debated whether her humility was real or staged. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's acts of repentance were sincere faith or calculated theater. Was she truly afraid of divine judgment, or did she simply understand that God made the best political ally when bishops could crown or condemn kings? Either way, the performance worked. The church could hardly excommunicate a queen who had just wept in its halls. And yet, when the prayers end and the congregation disperses, you linger long enough to catch a faint smirk tug at the corner of Fredegund's mouth. Her veil hides it from most, but not from you. For a moment, she is no longer the penitent widow. She is the strategist who has just secured another layer of protection. As she rises, the candles flicker, shadows playing across her face. The murmurs of amen still hang in the air, but beneath them, you hear the unspoken truth. Repentance may be holy, but in the hands of a queen like Fredegund, it is also just another tool in the arsenal of power. The seasons turn and the nursery grows louder with the cries of children. You follow Fredegund into a chamber warmed by braziers, where swaddled infants lie in carved cradles, their futures already tangled in dynastic webs. Her son, Clotaire II, babbles while nurses fuss with embroidered blankets, and you see the queen's hand rest lightly on his forehead, protective yet calculating. Mainstream fact: Clotaire II would eventually rule over a reunited Frankish kingdom, but in these early years he was only a vulnerable child surrounded by half-siblings and cousins, many of whom had legitimate claims of their own. Fredegund's role as regent required her not only to nurture him, but also to defend him against a maze of rival heirs. You notice how she treats some children like precious jewels, while others fade into the background. A stepson arrives, greeted with cool courtesy. A daughter by another marriage receives only a fleeting glance, and then there are her own infants, cradled close, shielded from drafts, guarded like treasures. The lesson is obvious. In Fredegund's world, survival is not a birthright, it's a strategy. Quirky tidbit. Frankish royals often gave children protective charms, little amulets of wolf teeth, carved bones, or even tiny bells meant to ward off spirits. One courtier whispers that Fredegund's children wear charms stitched secretly into their clothes, though others mutter that such trinkets are a poor defense against a mother's ambitions. Historians still argue whether Fredegund truly ordered the deaths of rival children or whether disease, tragically common, claimed them instead. Epidemics swept through Frankish courts, often wiping out several heirs in a single season, yet somehow, when rivals sickened, suspicion always fell on her. You can almost hear the chroniclers sharpening their quills, ready to record another accusation. You lean against the doorway as she rocks Clotair's cradle, humming a tune that sounds halfway between a lullaby and a battle hymn. The boy gurgles, reaching for her veil, while outside the hall, a messenger announces fresh unrest along the border. She doesn't flinch. To her, these two acts, soothing a child and plotting for a throne, belong to the same rhythm of survival. And you realize, watching her shadow bend over the cradle, that this queen's motherhood is unlike any other. It is tender and ruthless, soft and sharp all at once. For every child she protects, another is discarded like an old cloak. In her hands, the cradle is not just a place of comfort, it is a throne in miniature. You stroll with Fredegund through the palace chambers, where sunlight spills across woven tapestries, and the faint scent of dye clings to the air. Here the queen's power is displayed not with swords but with silks. Her gowns sweep the floor, heavy with embroidery, her veils shimmer in candlelight, and the jewels at her throat gleam as brightly as the coins in her treasury. Mainstream fact: early medieval queens often expressed authority through clothing. Rich textiles were symbols of wealth and legitimacy, especially when woven with imported dyes like Tyrian purple or stitched with gold thread. Fredegund, risen from servant to queen, knew the value of visual theater better than anyone. You pause by a mirror of polished bronze as she adjusts a gown trimmed with crimson thread. The embroidery twists into tiny, careful patterns, flowers, vines, and if you look closely, a hint of blood-red accents that make courtiers shift uneasily. Quirky tidbit: some Frankish nobles believed certain dyes carried spiritual power. Wearing deep red might invoke protection in battle, while green thread was said to calm fevers. In Fredegund's wardrobe, color itself becomes a language. Historians still argue whether chroniclers exaggerated her taste for finery in order to cast her as vain, or whether she truly delighted in fashion as a political tool. Gregory of Tours once complained that queens distracted kings with soft garments, but you suspect Fredegund knew exactly how to weaponize velvet and silk. Imagine her at a feast, her gown glittering, her veil arranged just so, the nobles squinting in awe while pretending not to notice. A knight raises his goblet, but his hand trembles. Not from the wine, but from the unsettling thought that this woman, dressed like a saint in stained glass, might also be planning someone's sudden illness. You drift closer, hearing her laugh softly at a lady-in-waiting's compliment. The sound is warm, almost disarming, yet it rings in the hall like a bell that tolls both welcome and warning. To Fredegund, fashion is more than vanity. It is armor, camouflage, and proclamation all stitched into silk. And as her train sweeps past your feet, you understand the quiet irony. This is a queen whose garments are as dangerous as her daggers. She doesn't need to draw blood. Her clothing alone whispers power, reminding everyone that she commands the room before she even speaks. You wander beyond the palace gates now, trailing Fredegund's retinue into the streets of Neustria. The air smells of wood smoke and fresh bread, the kind pulled from clay ovens in village squares. Children chase one another through muddy alleys, their laughter mixing with the clang of a blacksmith's hammer on glowing iron. For once, the story isn't only about queens and daggers. It's about the rhythm of everyday life in a kingdom under her watch. Mainstream fact: 6th century Neustria was a patchwork of towns, farms, monasteries, and trade routes. Ordinary people lived in wooden huts with thatched roofs, relying on barley bread, goat's milk, and the occasional feast day to brighten their diets. Taxes collected by the crown, grain, livestock, even cloth, were essential to maintaining the queen's treasury. You stand in the market square as peasants grumble about levies. A farmer leads 2 sheep forward, muttering that his tax has just bleated at him. Another drags a cart of onions, payment for soldiers he will never meet. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, a household tax could be paid in beeswax, since candles were critical for both churches and palaces. Imagine the queen's coffers glowing not with coins, but with sticky blocks of wax. Historians still argue whether the people of Neustria viewed Fredegund as a harsh ruler or simply one more figurehead in a long line of distant monarchs. Chroniclers, of course, painted her as cruel, but they rarely cared about the perspective of the bread bakers and plowmen. You pause by a well where women draw water, their chatter brisk and wry. They joke that the queen has never baked bread in her life, though perhaps she knows how to bake trouble. They laugh, but their eyes flick nervously toward the palace spire on the horizon. Even in gossip, her shadow stretches along. In the smithy, sparks leap like fireflies as iron tools clatter onto workbenches. The smith tells you bluntly, "As long as the queen keeps soldiers fed, I'll keep forging spears." Practical loyalty, hammered out one blade at a time. As dusk falls, smoke curls upward from hundreds of hearths, and you sense the heartbeat of Neustria, not in jeweled halls, but in ovens, forges, and fields. And yet, above it all, Fredegund's name threads through the conversations like smoke in the rafters. Whether feared or admired, she is present in every loaf, every tax, every tolling bell. The scratching of quills fills your ears as you step into a scriptorium, the chamber cool and faintly musty with ink and parchment. Here you meet not soldiers or courtiers, but the men who will decide how history remembers Fredegund. Gregory of Tours bends over his manuscript, the candlelight flickering across his sharp features as he dips his quill, eager to pin her deeds, or misdeeds, into the record forever. Mainstream fact: Gregory of Tours, 538 to 594, was the chief chronicler of this era, and much of what we know about Fredegund comes from his Historia Francorum. He portrayed her as ruthless, manipulative, and dangerously ambitious. Yet his perspective was far from neutral. He was a bishop deeply invested in the church's authority, and queens who meddled in politics were rarely painted in flattering light. You hear him mutter as he writes, shaking his head, calling her the new Jezebel of Neustria. His quill scratches faster whenever he recalls rumors of poison, adultery, or whispered curses. Quirky tidbit: scribes sometimes used powdered fish glue to erase mistakes, scraping parchment with a knife and then painting over it. You wonder how many edits Gregory made when deciding which sins to emphasize in her tale. Historians still argue whether Gregory exaggerated, inventing scandal to warn his audience about worldly temptations, or whether he reported genuine events distorted by gossip. Later chroniclers, copying his words, added flourishes of their own until Fredegund's image became less a person and more a caricature of medieval villainy. You walk among the stacks of scrolls, feeling the weight of ink thicker than steel. For every soldier she bribed, for every feast she presided over, it is these quills that carve her memory. Fredegund herself cannot control what they write, but she knows how to stage scenes that leave strong impressions. As you pass Gregory's desk, you glimpse the ink glisten, stories of assassinations, rumors of sorcery, the queen's whispered scandals. And you realize the irony. While Fredegund hoards treasure in Soissons, her true fortune is being shaped here, in ink-stained rooms where monks decide whether she is remembered as a ruler or a monster. The quills keep scratching, and the candle smoke curls upward like ghostly fingers, carrying her reputation into centuries she'll never see. The moonlight drips silver across Soissons, and you walk with Fredegund into the courtyard where shadows huddle against the walls. A servant crosses himself hurriedly, muttering that the queen walks too often at night. The rumors cling like smoke, that she dabbles in charms, that she whispers to the moon, that her steps stir more than dust in the darkness. Mainstream fact: accusations of witchcraft were a common weapon in the political arsenal of the early Middle Ages. Women in power, especially queens who meddled in warfare or succession, were easily branded as witches. Fredegund was no exception. Her enemies claimed she summoned spirits, brewed poisons under ritual, and cast curses against her rivals. Quirky tidbit: Frankish folk magic often involved odd household items, knots tied into strips of cloth, herbs hidden under pillows, or carved figurines placed in doorways. Imagine nobles gossiping that the queen's embroidered veils weren't just fashion but secret spell work. every stitch a curse. Historians still argue whether Fredegund herself believed in charms or whether these stories were purely slander. Some say she consulted wise women who offered potions and prayers. Others insist she used superstition as a smokescreen, letting her rivals quake at imagined curses while she pursued cold political strategies. Either way, the legend of the Witch Queen stuck. You watch her pause beneath the moon, her hand raised as if measuring its light. To her attendants, it is nothing more than a gesture of reflection, but to the guards at a distance it looks like sorcery in motion. Within hours the whispers spread. She conjured the moon. Inside the palace, courtiers talk of candles sputtering when she enters, of dogs whining in her presence, of children shivering at her touch. Yet when you stand close, you see only a woman with tired eyes, clever hands, and the weight of kingdoms on her shoulders. Still, you can't shake the feeling as you walk away under the cold stars. In a world where rumor is as sharp as steel, perhaps being feared as a witch is not a curse at all, but the sharpest kind of power. The years roll forward like wagon wheels on muddy roads, and you walk beside Fredegund as her rivalry with Brunhild stretches into its later chapters. The feud has outlived kings, toppled heirs, and outlasted countless battles. What began with the death of Galswintha has hardened into something larger than politics, a personal war that devours entire realms. Mainstream fact, Fredegund and Brunhild's conflict defined Merovingian politics for decades. Their struggle drew in sons, grandsons, and armies, creating a cycle of vengeance between Neustria and Austrasia. It was so notorious that later chroniclers wrote of it as if two queens alone had split the Frankish world in half. You sit in the council hall as Fredegund listens to reports. Brunhild has rallied fresh allies, stirring Austrasia like a hornet's nest. The queen drums her fingers on the armrest, her patience stretched thin but unbroken. Quirky tidbit. One tale claims Fredegund once hired an assassin disguised as a holy man, complete with clerical robes and psalms, to slip into Brunhild's court. The attempt failed, but the story clung like burrs, retold with relish by gossipers who found the disguise both shocking and hilarious. Historians still argue whether these assassination attempts were coordinated by Fredegund herself or by ambitious captains eager to impress her. Either way, the effect was the same. Brunhild never slept soundly, and every shadow stretched longer when Fredegund's name was spoken. You follow the two queens' rivalry into battlefields where their armies crash like storm waves, and into courts where treaties crumble at the scratch of a quill. Every time Brunhild seems ascendant, Fredegund counters. Every time Fredegund weakens, Brunhild presses, yet neither yields. At night, Fredegund sits by the hearth, her son's cradle now empty as he grows into a youth. She murmurs strategies while the fire snaps, her mind always circling back to Brunhild. It is no longer about inheritance alone, it is about proving who will write the final word in this duel of queens. And you realize, gazing into the fire beside her, that this rivalry has become more than politics. It is a contest of willpower, a decades-long chess match played with crowns and coffins, where even kings are pawns. The candles burn lower now, their wax spilling in crooked rivulets down iron holders. You watch Fredegund lean heavily against a carved chair, her once straight back beginning to bend, her hair streaked with silver hidden beneath a veil. Time, at last, has found the queen. Yet even as her hands tremble slightly, her mind remains sharp, her eyes still cold and calculating behind the soft blur of age. Mainstream fact, Fredegund lived into her 50s, remarkable for the 6th century, and ruled as regent until her death in 597. By then she had survived assassinations, childbirths, wars, and the deaths of countless rivals. Few queens of her time endured so long in such turbulent conditions. At night, you see her sit near the firelight, staring into flames that seem to replay her life. Servant girl, consort, queen, widow, regent. Around her, courtiers move softly, speaking as though afraid of disturbing her thoughts. Some believe she's mellowed, others whisper she's still weaving plots in the shadows. Quirky tidbit. One Frankish chronicle claimed that even in her final years, Fredegund kept a dagger under her pillow in case the Lord delayed his angels. You almost smile, picturing her scolding celestial messengers for poor timing. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's twilight years were spent in reflective penance or in continued intrigue. Did she spend her last breaths praying for forgiveness, or calculating how her son Clotaire might secure the throne after she was gone? The records never agree, but her reputation refuses to soften. You walk with her through the gardens, the autumn air crisp, fallen leaves crunching underfoot. She pauses, leaning on a servant's arm, yet her voice, when she speaks, is steady. Tell my son to be patient. Time destroys all rivals. Her words drift like smoke into the cold air, half wisdom, half warning. Back in her chamber, she warms her hands before the fire, the flames flickering against her lined face. In those sparks, you glimpse the same cunning girl who once carried water through these halls, unnoticed. Only now, she is cloaked in years and stories, her legacy as tangled as the smoke curling into the rafters. The bells toll again over Soissons, but this time it is not for a king. You follow the slow procession as word spreads. Fredegund is gone. The queen who outlasted enemies, scandals, and wars now lies still, her body dressed in the finery of a monarch. The halls that once echoed with whispers now hum with a strange quiet, as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. Mainstream fact, Fredegund died in 597 and was buried in the Basilica of Saint Denis near Paris, the same royal necropolis that would later cradle the bones of French kings and queens for centuries. Her son, Clotaire II, inherited her position and eventually united all Frankish realms under his crown. In death, her reputation becomes its own battlefield. Courtiers mutter that justice has at last claimed her. Others insist she died undefeated, her enemies still scrambling long after her final breath. Quirky tidbit, later tales claim that her tomb emitted a faint odor of smoke, as though even in death she smoldered with the memory of her sins. Probably superstition, but the image stuck, whispered by pilgrims who visited the basilica. Historians still argue whether her legacy should be read as villainy or brilliance. Was she a murderous schemer, or simply a woman surviving in a brutal world where men were praised for the same ruthlessness? The record leaves no clear verdict, only the echo of scandal wrapped in silk. You stand by her tomb as the candles gutter, their flames wavering against cold stone. Around you, murmurs ripple. She was dangerous. She was cunning. She was queen. And in that uneasy blend of fear and admiration, her legacy begins to fossilize. When you step outside, the autumn wind tugs at your cloak. The palace behind you looms silent, but the shadow of Fredegund lingers, stretching down the centuries. Her name, tangled in rumor and memory, is no longer hers to defend. It belongs to history, etched in equal parts scandal and awe. You sit among scholars centuries later, their books spread wide, the scratch of quills replaced now by murmured debate in dimly lit libraries. Fredegund is no longer flesh and blood, but an argument, a name that sparks endless discussions across lecture halls and parchment margins. Her life, tangled in rumor and record, refuses to rest quietly. Mainstream fact, historians have never agreed on Fredegund's true character. Medieval chroniclers, especially Gregory of Tours, painted her as a murderous schemer. Later, scholars questioned those accounts, pointing out that chroniclers often exaggerated female ambition to warn against unruly queens. Modern historians now debate whether she was truly extraordinary in her cruelty or simply playing by the same brutal rules that defined Frankish politics. One scholar insists she masterminded assassinations, rattling off examples like beads on a rosary. Another shakes his head, arguing that disease and coincidence were more likely culprits in a world where fevers killed faster than daggers. Historians still argue whether the scandal of her alleged liaisons with stepsons was a slander invented by enemies or a shadow of truth distorted over centuries. Quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, Romantic historians loved to dramatize her as a dark queen of early France, staging her as a Gothic villainess in plays and novels. She was less a person than a symbol, sometimes of female ambition, sometimes of corruption, always larger than life. You leaf through these retellings and realize something. Every era remakes Fredegund in its own image. To church scribes, she was sin in a veil. To Enlightenment historians, she was a cautionary tale. To modern scholars, she is a case study in power, gender, and survival. The debates swirl like candle smoke, refusing to settle. Was she Jezebel reborn, or was she simply pragmatic, ruthless in a world where men could slaughter brothers, yet still be praised as strong rulers? No answer satisfies. The very act of questioning keeps her alive, her name scribbled in margins, footnotes, and heated discussions. And as you close the book, you realize the truth. Fredegund's legacy is not a single story, but a restless argument echoing through time. The candlelight softens to amber as you sit once more in the palace of memory. Fredegund, that servant girl who rose to queen, has passed into legend, Yet her shadow lingers in every corridor, every whisper, every chronicler's line. You walk the length of her story, from the gossip of servants to the clang of armies, from poisoned goblets to gilded gowns, and you feel how one woman's life can ripple outward into centuries of fear and fascination. Mainstream fact, Clotaire II, her son, survived long after her death, eventually uniting all Frankish kingdoms by 613. Whatever the truth of Fredegund's deeds, her regency ensured his survival in a perilous time when heirs often perished before their crowns were fitted. In her final image, you see a woman seated by firelight, her veil hiding silver hair, her hands lined yet steady, her gaze still keen. The scandals swirl around her like smoke, rumors of incest, poison, witchcraft, but the fact remains. She endured. Few rulers of her age lasted as long or left such a complicated trail behind. Quirky tidbit. Centuries later, ballads and folk tales in France still muttered her name, often twisting her into a half-witch, half-queen figure. Children were warned not to wander at night, lest Fredegund's shadow catch them. Imagine being a bedtime bogey woman long after your bones rested in Saint Denis. Historians still argue whether she was villain, survivor, or both. To some, she embodies the dangers of unchecked ambition. To others, she reveals the double standards of medieval memory. Men could kill brothers without stain, yet a queen who schemed became immortalized as monstrous. And now you lean back, letting her long, scandalous saga drift to a close. The torches dim, the voices fade, the palace settles into silence. Fredegund's shadow recedes, but her story lingers, wrapping you like a heavy cloak. The halls grow quiet now, their echoes softened as though draped in velvet. You feel the air cooling, the flicker of candles slowing, each flame stretching and yawning before it rests. The long tale of Fredegund settles into stillness, her intrigues fading like distant thunder. Breathe slowly as you picture the palace empty, torches extinguished, only the hush of wind weaving through corridors. The gossip, the schemes, the feasts, and the fears, they have all drifted away, leaving nothing but silence. You walk across stone floors that no longer remember footsteps, past chambers where shadows curl softly, harmless now. Outside, the night sky spreads wide, the stars scattered like pale coins across dark velvet. You tilt your head back, letting that endless calm wash over you. The earth turns slowly, steadily, carrying you forward whether you notice or not. Fredegund's story, with all its sharp edges, dissolves into something gentle here at the end. What remains is not the scandal, not the whispered fears, but the reminder that even the fiercest tales must yield to time, to quiet, to rest. So let your breath deepen, your eyelids grow heavier, let go of daggers and rumors, crowns and chronicles. Instead, hold on to the image of a dimly lit chamber where the fire has burned down low, its last embers glowing soft and steady. The queen has gone to sleep, the courtiers have gone to sleep, and now it's your turn. Drift slowly, peacefully, into that same stillness.